So hatcheries, Jim, as you hear from Phil McGinty and David Summer from the Tay, there's a lot to learn. There's a lot to digest. People are talking about it more and more. But really interestingly, we wanted to follow up with another episode from probably the most internationally renowned fishery scientist expert, who will sum it all up for us, but I think makes a big jump and has called for radical intervention is needed now.
Anybody who has shown any interest in the Atlantic salmon in the past 30, 40 years will have come across Ken Whelan's publications. He really is renowned internationally as a fisheries scientist with an extensive international experience and substantial publication record. He's the go-to guy, whether it's stock management, fishery management, environmental impacts. There is no one more learned about the Atlantic salmon perhaps out there than Ken Whelan. And we're very privileged to have him on the show to sum up Series 1 and what we can do going forward.
The drop in numbers is really, it's amazingly dramatic. And there are simple numbers that people can remember. The one that I think is most upsetting and most stunning is the fact that we have quite good numbers in terms of marine survival of the young salmon. How many of them actually come back to us as adult salmon? So the young salmon, as you know, are called smolts. These are the silver fish that are making their way out to sea after probably on average about 2 years in freshwater. And it used to be in the past, and in the past, I mean, maybe 30, 40 years ago, that if you had 100 smolts going to sea and they stayed at sea for just 1 year, you would, on a good year, you could get 20 or 25 of those back. Now you're in a situation where it's a fantastic return if you get 8. And it's normally 5 or less. And then for the bigger salmon, it's progressively less and less. So we're now in a situation where we're getting very small numbers back into the river systems. And it's a combination, I think, of two things. There's a double whammy in that they're being hit certainly in terms of factors that are affecting them at sea. But obviously, there's a lot of man-made factors that we can control that also we've done a really poor job at actually controlling. So I think it's a matter of a twin track approach. You can't just look at one particular area, you have to look at both. And I think that's really the key to trying to stabilize the population. I think that's the stage we're at. I think you have to look at the salmon, I always think, as a patient. So first of all, you have to triage it. Then you have to stabilize it. Then you have to be in a situation then where you actually bring it to recovery. And then having got it to recovery, then you can actually see then, can you expand it? So I think that's the way you have to deal with the patient. And I think at this stage, we've done a bad job even initially at the triage part. But I think we are at the triage part now in the sense that we know the problems that are there and we really need to think about stabilizing. That's really where we're at.
Do you think, obviously we know that the Atlantic salmon as a species has recently been put on the red list, the endangered list. Is that going to help?
That is just the most important breakthrough. It really is an important breakthrough. And jumping right ahead, I mean, what does that mean to anglers? And I'm going to be a bit outspoken here because I think this is really important. We just don't have time, guys, and we're fiddling about. First of all, no wild salmon should be killed. End of. I don't care. And I was the one who did a lot of my team did a lot of the science that's behind the regulations and so on we have here in Ireland. Got to the stage now where we have this creature that's near critically endangered. This creature should not be killed. So I did a little podcast, a little video podcast for Atlantic Salmon Trust on catch and release, and we called it The Gift, because when we're doing the interview at the end, the interviewer asked me, why are you telling people to do catch and release? And I said, look, I want all anglers to give a gift back to their local river. And it's not to their trust, it's not to the local conservation group. It's not to the water companies. It's a gift to that river. And give back a gift of wild eggs. There's no one else can replicate those wild eggs. You cannot make them. You can't make them in a hatchery. So the idea that you would kill those wild eggs is anathema at this stage. And I really think people have to take this seriously. And I would ask anglers not to be waiting on the authorities to make rules. You should be showing the way. You absolutely should be showing the way. And I think that's really important, that it has to be a very, very simple equation for people. just tell them, no, we don't kill any more wild salmon. We've put ourselves in a situation where through the wild fish and with other colleagues, they've managed to do a fantastic job at getting these fish designated to such a position now where governments have to act. Let us as anglers act. I think that's really important, that we now start doing that straight away and not waiting for complicated rules. The story is these fish are on their fins, if you like, and therefore we have to help them. That's it.
I mean, should we be fishing for them, Ken? There's an argument to say, should we leave them alone?
I must say, I'm having that discussion with myself at the moment. I think in a situation where you have a good surplus of salmon, and we're lucky in Ireland, in some of the rivers, we still have a reasonable surplus of salmon. I think there's a justification there. I think there's certainly a justification if we go ranching. And I think we have to start looking at ranching as a real alternative. And I've been involved in ranching for many, many years. There's a huge amount of confusion about what ranching is and a lot of misinformation about what ranching is. But I think in the context of trying to support rod angling into the future, ranching has to play a major part in that. And I think in rivers that are under pressure, I think people really have to think about the consequences of fishing in those particular rivers. So I think that debate has to come to the fore.
Well, let's maybe start it, Ken, in terms of, because obviously your expertise and knowledge, just explain to people what is ranching, what's maybe gone on before, has it worked, has it not, and why you're arguing for the need of it.
Okay, well, let me just explain a little bit about this thing about the surpluses and so on, because this is bread and butter to me, but some of the folks listening to us may not be as familiar with those particular concepts. So the salmon, one of the reasons it's such a fantastic creature is that it lays a very significant number of eggs. So it produces something like 650, 700 eggs per pound body weight. And this isn't because it's trying to actually be wasteful, but it's trying to produce very large numbers of juveniles because the survival to that stage where they're going to sea is quite low. So you can take it on average, it's about 1%. So about one of those eggs will eventually go out to sea as a little smolt in an entirely natural situation. When they come back in, if they're very successful and they lay as adults lots and lots of eggs, they can at times then produce very significant numbers of fish back into their rivers under very natural situations. At that time, you have more fish in the river than are technically needed to keep it going biologically. And that surplus is what anglers really depend on to have really good fishing. They need years where the fish are producing far more than the fish that are needed to keep the stock of fish going. And in a river where you still have surpluses, where you still have this excess over what is needed just to keep it ticking over, I think there's justification for angling. But if you're in a situation where your river is below that, and even if you're doing catch and release, there will be a certain amount of mortality in that catch and release. And that's a debate I think we have to have. Is that very small mortality, is that now acceptable? Are we happy that that's acceptable? I don't know. I think we need to have a discussion on that. I'd be concerned about it because I think if we're going to actually maintain a position whereby we're trying to protect a creature that now is almost endangered, I think it will be hard to justify fishing for them in a situation where a particular stock is under pressure.
And is that why you're looking at the ranching, you think, as a kind of a way to kind of...
Well, the ranching is purely as... I'm very conscious, having worked so long in Scotland, I'm very conscious of the importance of these fish to owners and to bigger estates and so on. The model in Ireland, Jim, as you probably know, is very different. Most of our waters are run by small individual owners or by clubs. We don't have the big estate issues that you'd have in Scotland. So there's always going to be kickback in terms of we have to keep the rod fisheries open. I think we'd all like to see rod fisheries open as well. And ranching can achieve that, but only in particular locations and only if people understand what ranching is and how it works. And I think that's really important. And what tends to happen is that, people get some wild eggs and they grow some wild fish and they get some wild smolts and they put them in the sea and they say, well, that's ranching. That's not ranching. And I think they need to understand what's involved, the complexity of it, and the cost. The cost is very, very big, but it is an option if we're keen to try and keep some of our rod fisheries functioning. The most important thing to understand is that ranching is an aquaculture operation. Okay, so this is a different form of aquaculture. This has nothing to do with wild fish. You're using the wild fish as the ingredient originally, but you're developing a form of aquaculture. So the chap that I replaced in the Salmon Research Trust and then became Salmon Research Agency was a wonderful, innovative biologist called Dr. David Piggins. And when he was running the research station in Mayo, he needed additional fish for his experiments. And the number of wild salmon he had was very healthy, but he didn't have any surplus salmon to any great extent that he could use for tagging and for doing all sorts of different studies. So he read up about ranching in the Pacific, and he decided that he would go salmon ranching in Burrishoole in Ireland. And this had nothing to do with angling. This was to do with producing more fish for experimental purposes. So he started about 1964-65, taking grills, wild grills, coming in from the sea and taking the eggs from them, and of course producing then the smolts in captivity. Then what he did was he actually took a very, very long time to develop a core ranching stock. So only the fish that came back from the sea were used as adults for the next generation. So he didn't mix in any more wild fish. So over a 10, 12, 14-year period, he built up and built up and built up his actual brood stock of ranched fish. Now, there were no genetics available to him at the time. So this was all done with old-fashioned but very efficient fish husbandry. So having built up this stock of fish, he realized that these fish, the return rate of these fish was actually improving over time. He was really very, very good at fish husbandry. So really careful, these fish were reared at low density. The most important thing was that they had really, really good fins. The flow rates were designed so that they were actually trained as long distance swimmers. He put all the features into the development of the ranching stock so that these fish would survive well in a concrete pond, but would also survive well at sea. And finally, when they were looked at, they were genetically quite different to the actual core stock of fish that he had originally used. So he produced literally a horse for a course. He had produced a stock of fish that would actually artificially would return back to you. But what we found out subsequently was Phil McGinnity, who used to work with me, is a very brilliant geneticist. He was able to show that they don't, in controlled experiments, they don't perform well in the wild at all, these fish now. They're much less efficient at actually looking after themselves if you try and put them out as babies into the wild. But they're very good at surviving in a pond, and they're very good at actually surviving at sea. Not near as good as wild fish, but they're still significantly better than most stocked fish would be. So what you have then is a creature that you don't want that creature crossing with wild fish.
Right.
It's only produced for three reasons, okay? So it's produced to give you more eggs. They're produced to give you the next generation of fish, if you're a salmon scientist and want to use them for research purposes. And the fish, when they came back, they suddenly created for David this very, very useful rod fishery, because all of these fish were gathering in this saltwater lake below his traps. And the anglers suddenly realized this was fantastic. And the fish were, on average, they were maybe a pound, 700 grams or so heavier than any of the wild fish. Fabulous looking fish, beautiful fins. And I can remember being with David before I ever worked up there. And in came two Icelanders to talk to him about his ranching techniques. And those ranching techniques were then taken to Iceland. And they developed a ranching program in Iceland that I was lucky enough to film when I went out with Kevin. So they had the ranching program in Iceland, and that produced both fish to the rod and a commercial fishery. But unfortunately, they had huge issues with straying because of the commercial ranches, and they stopped the commercial ranching, but they continue now with the rod ranching. And the ranched salmon that David Piggins developed in Burrishoole, when we had the sea trout crisis with the sea lice, they are the fish that were actually sold to Delphi, to Peter Mantle in Delphi, to kickstart the Delphi ranching program. So developing a ranching stock and using the ranching strains, that's the key. And separating them out completely from the wild fish. Don't mix your metaphors. Separate them out completely. And there are some really massive issues here, because imagine a situation where you've released a very large number of fish out to sea, and you get a very, very low drought, a very low water drought year, and huge numbers of fish come back, and they just turn brown in the estuary. There's no commercial fishery out there. You can't get them into your river. How do you handle this? What do you do with these fish? So this isn't a simple thing, but it definitely works. The fish are fantastic. They're high quality. Anglers love it. But at the same time, they're very expensive. And nowadays, there's a lot of environmental hurdles to get over. If you've all those fish in the estuary, would you create more sea lice? You know, because you have to think of it as aquaculture. You can't think of it as wild. But I think there's opportunities, not necessarily in the rivers that currently exist as salmon rivers, but certainly in some of the rivers that might have very modest runs of salmon now at the moment. They could be the rivers that would become your ranching rivers, because they're manageable and the size is manageable and you can put a trap in.
If this isn't a successful example and rivers are looking at maybe we need to, go down the kind of stocking hatchery route, it's this broodstock you need to be integrating, or?
Yes is the answer to that, but there are a few caveats. There's a few others that I know of that I think are very close for various reasons. I won't go into any detail now, but there are some other stocks that people have, they've gone ranching for other purposes, and they've inadvertently produced stocks of fish now that I think would perform very well as ranched fish. But I think you're down to a situation where if you want to get a really successful ranching program going quickly, you have to get a ranch strain. Whether you get the ranch strain from Iceland, whether you get it from Ireland, wherever, you need to. It's exactly like buying a racehorse. You have to look at the pedigree, and you have to bring in, and that again is a big issue, whether you'll get permission to do this or not. Would you get permission to bring in a non-native ranching strain to test it out? I don't know whether that's possible or not, but that's logically what you would do. Now, what we did was when we gave or sold the smolts to Peter down in Delphi, they actually performed better than we could possibly have imagined. And they were transported from Burrishoole down to a completely different system. And over the years, we've seen very little evidence of any impact from strain. So just to separate that into two pieces, strain doesn't mean that the adult fish don't appear in neighboring river systems. Strain means that they actually end up spawning in those other systems. And there's very little evidence from the limited amount of ranching we've done here that happens. But there are several different provisos. And one of the key ones, which I think may have been an issue in Iceland, you need to be really careful about imprinting the smolts. So if you're moving the smolts from one location to another, within about 6 or 8 weeks of going to sea, those fish are actually imprinting the smell or the taste of the river they're going to come back to into their brain. And if you make a mess of imprinting those fish, they'll get totally confused. So you really need to know what you're doing in order to be able to make this work. And it's not a simple matter of taking wild fish from any system, growing them to a small stage, and then expecting to get performance similar to the other ranching strains.
That's fascinating. And I don't know whether you're aware, Ken, or not, that the Atlantic Salmon Trust, who you know well and have worked for many years on and off over the decades, at the moment, they're serious discussions about introducing some kind of ranching or stocking, as they're calling it, on the River Dee in Scotland, on the Royal Dee. And they're going to start with two styles. One is from memory, because I was on a webinar with them just the other day. One is from they will take the Celts and they will take the kelts out and they will bring them back on and then strip them and use them as the brood stock. Or they will take the smolt, that instead of letting the smolt go out to sea, as we know, which is where the huge challenges are and the mortality rates are massive, as well as going downriver to get to sea, may I add. They'll just take the smolt out and bring them on into a sexually mature fish in the hatcheries there or in the labs. So what are your thoughts about that, and how does that feed into what you've just spoken about with regards to the wild strain, the all-important wild strain on the River Dee, and these new fish?
Now, can I go backwards a step? When you replay this, okay, watch, you have just done exactly what I said not to do.
Okay.
Let me explain to you. Now, this is exactly why the confusion arises. Every single angler I know does this. They say, right, they're going to do this work on the Dee, and they're going to go ranching, or maybe it's stocking. Now, that's the point. You're mixing the metaphors. The ranching has absolutely nothing to do with what they're doing on the Dee. Okay, and this is just Ken Whelan's view. I think if we're going to get ranching as a successful initiative, you have to separate it out completely from efforts to try and support wild spawning stocks. It has absolutely nothing to do with supporting wild spawning stocks. It's purely to give eggs, to give fish flesh if you want to harvest the fish, which they do in Burrishoole to offset the cost, or if you want to give angling. So it's an aquaculture initiative to provide you with fish.
So can that only be done, Ken, then in a dead river, so to speak?
No, it can be only done in a river where you have a trap. And that was one of the big contentious issues on Delphi, was that originally there was a trap to be put in on Delphi. So what they do on Delphi is they do netting in the autumn time to take out as many of the ranched fish as they can. But my own personal view is I don't think that's adequate. I think there should be a trap. And what you do is you adipose clip, you clip the little fin on the back of the ranched fish. And if you have a trap or a lifting floor, as we have in Burrishoole, you can separate out the fish just by sight, and you can lift out the ranched fish. You can separate them out from the wild. And that's why in the bigger rivers, it would be very, very cumbersome and complex to try and do this. But to get back to Jim's question, and obviously I'm still associated with AST. I'm lucky enough to be one of their vice presidents, so I'm well aware of this particular project. I think we're at a stage now with some of our really valuable stocks where intervention is absolutely called for. I think we can't sit back any longer and think it's going to repair itself. We have to see if we can help it along. And I think, as I understand it, in terms of what they're doing on the Dee, I think it's very sensible. They're taking techniques that have already been looked at and partially developed in other countries. There's been some very good work in the Bay of Fundy. There's been some work that I'm well aware of in France. There's been some work in Norway, all of which are around these particular type of approaches. So if you have a fish that has already laid her eggs, and you can then get that fish back to a situation where it's holding eggs the next year and release it into the wild, and you get a second batch of eggs out of that particular female, they're seeing whether or not that is useful in terms of boosting the stocks of juvenile fish. And most importantly, whether or not the fish that come back at the same rate, i.e. that the survival is the same from a reconditioned Celt, from the juveniles from a reconditioned Celt, as distinct from a wild Celt. So again, I think that's very good, because again, it takes out the very big losses that you see. Generally, we see maybe about 5 or 6% of our fish coming back as previous spawners. We tend to get quite high survivals, funny enough, out as far as the ocean. But it's when they get to the ocean is when the numbers really drop. So if you can save some of those and you can then reproduce that set of eggs for a second time, that seems well worthwhile having a shot at and seeing exactly what's happening. And then the idea with the smolts is that you let the smolts basically sort themselves out in terms of what I was describing earlier, where there's huge competition amongst the eggs and the fry coming out from the eggs and the parr and so on. So you end up with very tiny number of smolts, relatively speaking, going to sea. But if you can get over the marine survival part and actually get those perfectly wild fish to the adult stage and try them in freshwater by again releasing them and letting them spawn naturally. Again, I think those two things are well worth looking at and seeing what contribution they'd make. And the purpose there is to protect the wild stock of fish. So that's why I'm separating out this from ranching. I see ranching as a substitute for the angler's need to go angling. But I think that all of these other things then would happen in the background, where you would actually be trying all these innovations. And it's great to see now that AST are working with colleagues in places like Maine. There's been some fabulous work ongoing in Maine for the last 5 or 6 years, looking at how we can help nature along. It's quite complicated because the genetics of all of this are very complicated, but I think it is time to intervene, and I wholeheartedly support those initiatives.
Great. Just on that, on the subject of genetics, Ken, obviously the big question, or one of the big questions, is if we start stocking in the manner that you've just described so wonderfully, such as they're planning on the D. The unknown, I guess, is if we take out the fish going out to sea, or we take the eggs from a reconditioned Celt, is that going to mess with the DNA, with the genetics, and therefore the sort of the survival of the fittest, to put it crudely, the Darwinian nature of the salmon? Is it going to take away the strongest survive, and that's what we need ultimately, especially now?
We're in a situation where I think the numbers are now so low. I mean, they have a beautiful index system called the Gurnock burn that I've been watching for decades on the D. If I remember right, the Gurnock was down to 2 fish, I think, a couple of years ago. So, putting what we're describing into the Gurnock is actually, it's not going to damage anything. So I think they're going to be super careful, and they have a really good team of geneticists who are well aware of this stuff, and we've great new technology. So they're really, really conscious of the fact that this is tricky. But at the same time, they're not going to be producing very large numbers of eggs. So if you sit down with your calculator, I always do this. If you sit down with your calculator and just work out the number of eggs that are being laid in your local river very roughly, you'll see that it comes to huge millions very quickly, and huge millions of fry and very significant numbers of smolts, even at a time when our survivals are low. So the very modest number of fish, of experimental fish, if you like, that will be released are very useful and significant, hopefully, for science. But they're not actually going to impact on the genetics of the overall stock, unless you're in a situation where they prove to be really successful, and then they'll mass produce them. But they'll only mass produce them if they're absolutely certain that they're going to produce an analogous fish to the wild fish. And that's what I mean by intervention. I think we have to be seen to be proactive, because in the past, what would we have done in the past? So in the past, let me take the River Moy that I know well in Ireland here, which has a phenomenal potential in terms of numbers of fish. I'm sure in the past, the Moy was probably holding somewhere in the region of 120, 180,000 spawning fish in the autumn time. That's how productive this river is. So we know from the work again of Phil McGinnity and his colleagues that there's 4 or 5 absolutely, completely different stocks of fish in the River Moy. So we would have gone down to the ridge pool with our net last September, and we would have taken out our brood stock out of the River Moy, completely unaware of which stocks of fish we were taking these fish from. We would have put them in a hatchery. We would have decided, probably as most hatchery operators do, myself included, you tend to be drawn to the really healthy looking fish. So you take the big healthy male and you take the big healthy female, and you're stripping fish from 2 completely opposite ends of the catchment. You're then going up, let's say you're releasing fry. You're then going up in sort of May time. You're picking what you subjectively think is a lovely stretch of river, and you're pouring these fish in there, probably into the mouths of very hungry trout. So you've messed with the genetics, you've messed with the biology. So I think we know enough now not to do that. But I certainly think we can't sit back and fiddle while Rome burns. I think we now have to very carefully start moving forward. And that's why the pressure is going to come on now, where people still want to go fishing So we have to look at new things. And that's why I'm just suggesting the ranching as a discussion point. Let's think a new thing.
So we're hearing of hatcheries, we're hearing of stocking, but should we just be looking at and calling it from ranching from now on?
If it depends on your objective. So we had a big conference, I think it was 2013, a wonderful conference on stocking. And we'd everyone, with all the players. We had the anglers, we had the managers, we had really good scientists from all over the world. It's all on the internet. All the presentations are still on YouTube. At the end, at the discussion period, I said all what I've said now at that meeting. It fell on deaf ears. But anyway, at the end, when I was doing the discussion period, I asked one simple question. I asked the audience, are you here because you want to catch more fish, or are you here to save the wild salmon? And they all told me they were there to save the wild salmon. And I don't believe them. I think at least half of that audience were there because they want to catch more fish. And as a biologist, I'll respond in two different ways. If you tell me you want to catch more fish, I'll think about ranching. If you tell me you want to actually protect the fish, I'll start closing rivers and I'll start stopping angling and so on. And there's a contradiction there. And it's just for people to be clear as to what they're doing. And I think, of course, they should be protecting the wild fish. But the timeline for generating the surpluses to give you angling is very long. So many years ago, we were closing the drift nets. We were buying out the drift nets here in Ireland. And we were a week away from the decision in our parliament in relation to that. And a friend of my dad's rang me from the River Slaney. And he asked me a very simple question. He said, Ken, when am I going to have wild salmon on my table at Easter again? Okay. And I said to him, well, looking at the data we have from the Slaney at the moment, which was in a particularly bad state, it's a beautiful river, Jim, you'd love it. It's all 2C winterfish, very few grids, beautiful small 2C, just like the D, 2C winterfish. And it was on its knees at that point. And I said to him, well, I think it'll be at least 50 years before we'll actually get to where we were 20 years ago, and he got really upset. Not with me, but the reality of what we were dealing with. Because at the end of the day, I said to him, look, it takes 5 years to produce one particular cycle of springers. 10 years, it's only 2 cycles, okay? So 50 years, it's only 10 cycles.
Yeah.
So in reality, from the modeling my colleagues were doing, that seemed fast. That was good. So that's the problem, is that people, we obviously all live within our own little lifespan. We have to, and think more importantly, within that lifespan. So because of that, we tend to want things to happen within that time period. And if they're on their knees like this, we have to be realistic in terms of where this particular program is bringing us. So I think the D one is very good because they're looking initially at 2030. And overall, they're looking at 2050. I think those timescales are real. I think they're very good. But again, I know I'm harping on about this, but I think we need to be thinking about angling as well, because people are confusing the two things. They are thinking that this is going to produce big numbers of fish on the rod. It's going to save the salmon, but it's not necessarily going to produce big numbers of fish until you're generating surpluses. And that's going to depend a lot on the marine as well.
So I think it's the problem, Ken, that scientists, a lot of fishery science, is approaching it from the wild salmon perspective. So there's a lot of opposition to hatcheries, ranching, any of that kind of stuff. They say, no, you have to focus on the conservation. Here's the science that says hatcheries don't work. Here's the science that says you can't go down that route, in the sense of that it'll just damage the wild stock, and let's not even consider it. Which is why I'm saying it's really enlightening to hear you, Ken, say we need to actually start looking at this.
To be honest, let me put myself in my professional role in the past, when I particularly was with the Central Board, when I acted for a time as an advisor to the minister. My job was to protect wild salmon. That was my job. So it was in that context. That's why I asked the question in 2013. I explained to people, as a biologist, I think my job is to protect wild salmon. My job is not to produce more salmon to the angler. It's to protect the wild salmon, and the salmon produce more salmon to the angler by producing surplus extra fish. And yet the anglers think the stocking is going to produce extra fish and can't understand why the biologists are against the stocking. And hopefully our debate this morning now is helping to try and clarify that we shouldn't be fighting. This isn't a matter of fighting, But people who are promoting stocking need to understand they could damage the wild fish with the stocking if they don't do it properly. And they won't produce big numbers of surplus fish for a long time. And if they want fish for catching, they have to think of other ways of doing it, I think, anyway.
Is there enough there to prove that we're not doing long-term damage to nature and the salmon by doing this?
Okay, another indirect way of answering that, but hopefully it'll be a powerful argument. I stood in the water, not too far from where you are, down in Dungarvan with Jason. In late June, on a Sunday evening last year, we had just run a course for people, teaching them fly fishing for saltwater fish. And everyone had gone, and Jason and I stayed on to see could we catch some more of the thin-lipped mullet. And I put my hand in the water, and I really was shocked. It was so warm. And I had no idea that we were getting hit by that marine heat wave at that stage. And I said to Jason, and he came back out into the water, and we stood there like fools as the light went down, saying, "My God, this is ridiculous. This is the Mediterranean." And that marine heat wave actually pushed up the temperatures around Donegal in the northwest of Ireland by 4 degrees for several weeks. So I'm afraid we've done our messing with nature. Our messing with nature is now being reflected in terms of these enormous changes from climate change. So the argument that we shouldn't mess with nature is gone way out the door. And we really have to now try and trust the scientists to be super careful at what they do. But I really do believe that we have to intervene. There is no option now except to intervene, at least in some locations. That doesn't mean that we go mad stocking and building hatcheries, but we need to look at innovative techniques and see if we can produce innovative techniques that, in parallel with big programs to try and lift the pressures off the fish, can do the trick for us in terms of producing more more wild smolts to go to sea, which to some extent might counteract the losses at sea and give us a stronger run of fish back into the rivers. Remember the analogy I said earlier about the patient, the stages that we're at, the triage, the stabilization, the recovery. So at the end of the day, we're hopefully thinking now about the stabilization phase. Then we have to get to the recovery phase. And it's in the recovery phase that we probably will start applying these techniques. And then after that, then we're building the surpluses. So I think that's the way to approach it. And I think people have to come with us as scientists in terms of doing this. Otherwise, there's a real risk that we will start losing individual stocks.
Thank you, Ken. That's a great way of rounding it up there and bringing in climate change. And just to jump off further, if I may, Dara and I, try as we might, we've had Charles Clover on, the Blue Marine Foundation. We're desperate to learn and to share with our audience more about what happens to our fish out at sea, knowing the huge mortality rate that they face out there.
I'm sad to say that, since we ended our big Salmon at Sea, our SALSEA program, program ended with our big conference in 2012. The field work ended about 2010. We have never followed these fish out to sea. We haven't had a follow through. We've lots and lots of modeling going on. There's lots and lots of very intensive research going on. We don't have any simple answers, I'm afraid, in terms of the marine stuff, but we have some really clear indications as to what might be happening. So there's some very good work has been funded by AST looking at the plankton, and that'll be published now very soon. And there certainly are very major plankton changes, planktonic changes off the west coast of Scotland around the time when the smolts are actually going to sea. And that's no great surprise because we know from the marine side of things that the oceans are changing and that they're changing fast. So again, just think about it maybe in simple terms. So we've brought our little smolt then to the estuary. And when the smolt gets to the estuary, it's made this incredible transition from freshwater to saltwater. So that's already put quite a lot of stress on it. But thankfully, most of the transition has already taken place in freshwater. It's actually happier in saltwater than it is in fresh. So I always visualize my research station in Burrishoole off the west coast of Ireland because it was actually quite close to what we call the smolt highway. So the smolt highway is this current that the fish will actually follow on their way up to their first feeding grounds, which we now know clearly are off the northwest coast of Norway. So that when the fish goes out, or indeed is heading out to that smolt highway, that fish has to feed. And nature has designed it so that the planktonic animals that creature needs, that those creatures are of the right size and have the right nutritional content. So in the stable situation we would have had 100 years ago, that pattern was taken almost as a given, that the synchronicity of the plankton being available at that time of year in that particular location, that was met by the fish actually moving out and starting to feed. And why is that so important? Can they not, starve for a while and then survive? Think about what these fish are doing. And it was an oceanographer said this to me many years ago, and he was so right. So our little smolts are going out in round terms. Let's say they go out at 14 centimeters. They're coming back to us at 55 to 60 centimeters as grills. And they're coming back to us in about 14 or 15 months' time. They're not doing much swimming. If you look at the energetics, if you look and see what that body actually needs, it needs food. It needs to be growing all the time to make that incredible growth from 14 centimeters to 55. If anything interferes with that, it makes that fish weaker. That sea out there is full of predators. And if that fish is any way weaker than it should be, good night, it's gone. And I think that's really what's happening. I think we're in a situation where the changes in the ocean are so profound that we're having hit and miss years. We're having a situation where at times everything goes right, but much more frequently now, things are going wrong. If they get stuck in the wrong current, we've saw that from Salsea. And surface currents are really important to smolts because they're right at the very surface layers of the ocean. If you have winds going in the wrong direction, that can actually change the surface currents. So my little fish coming out from Northwest Ireland, rather than turning right and going to Norway, if the winds are wrong, he may basically end up going slightly left and over towards Iceland. He's gone then. He's gone to me. He's not actually going to make the grade at all. So it's all down to the way the marine environment is moving. And at this stage, from a salmon point of view, we don't have enough information to be able to see exactly what's happening. But what I found very frustrating was the fact that when the big Salsea program was ongoing, we managed to identify, at least tentatively, where the first feeding grounds for these salmon were. And we came up with this idea that, look, if the fish are gathering there every year, could you not survey them in that particular location and see how well they're doing? At least you could tell people a year in advance, this is a very bad year or this is a very good year. And we've never done that. So we leave them on their merry way. We build lots and lots of models. We fund lots of research. My feeling is, and I'm biased because of the amount of effort we put in collectively to try and get out to sea the first time, I think we're mad not to be out there following them, because I don't think we can possibly understand what's happening if we're not out there at various stages following them on their track.
It seems so obvious, and it's something that I'm personally very fascinated in. I'm trying to get a project off the ground to do exactly that. But it sounds very simplistic to say let's follow them and then we can monitor them. But the reality of that, how are you gonna? You can't. What do you do? Do you follow a tagged smolt? I mean, that's going to be tricky. How do you follow fish that are going out into the open ocean to the Voring Plateau or wherever they're going? How do you monitor them to the extent that you need to get that data?
When we started Salsea in 2008, this is what we faced. So we had these ships that we had got, maybe 18, 20,000 a day for a ship. We got these ships we got for nothing, to involve us in the program. And we went out there not knowing what we were doing. And the very, very first haul of fish we took off Galway, we got 2 salmon smolts and 2 or 3 sea trout. And we got fish almost the whole journey. We got 3,000-4,000 fish during the journey. So I think we know enough about it now in terms of the smolt highway, the location of the fish. And remember, the fish can't swim all over the ocean when they're tiny. Keep thinking about the energetics. These fish have to keep retaining energy, not wasting energy. So they're going to feed within the current. So if you know the pinch points in the current, you can actually sample those pinch points on the way up. And you certainly can sample in the area where they're feeding because they're being caught as a bycatch. And the Norwegian scientists can actually sample them whenever they wish. So yes, there are ways of doing it. And in the past, we had to unfortunately, we had to kill the fish in order to get the samples. So perhaps we can go a step further and we can actually start looking at other methods. So one thing that fascinates me, because I've been involved with environmental DNA now since maybe about 2016 or so, I think we're in a situation now where we probably could start taking water samples, and where we can screen the water samples for salmon DNA in those pinch points, and start understanding then what's happening in terms of not so much looking for the fish as looking for evidence of the fish. It's well worth a try. I mean, again, it's a matter of pushing out the boat here. Not saying like we can't do it, but let's go out and try. Let's see what works. We had a great example of that with a paper that's just been published, where one of the Marine Institute wave gliders from Ireland here, we put it on station off the west coast of Scotland in an area where we had picked up quite a lot of smolts during the SALSI program. So we had this tube-like submarine just under the surface, right? So the base is under the surface. It's on the surface as such, but it has part of it is just submerged. So it's waving, it's moving along on the waves, okay? And it's going east-west, east-west. So it's on duty, seeing kind of pick up some transmitter tags from the smolts. And it managed to pick up 4 smolts. I mean, this tiny little yellow tube managed to pick up 4 smolts because the scientists, I should say, put it in an area where from the netting, we had shown that there was quite a concentration of smolts in the past. So we need to be building on these things. One of our biggest issues is the fact that we manage our migratory fish as freshwater fish. So we are not part of the marine world. We don't have access to ships. We don't have access to the marine programs. It's improving, but it's very, very, very slow. And that's been a real difficulty for us down the years.
I mean, am I right in thinking that one of the main hurdles, as basic as it is that the Atlantic salmon isn't classified as a marine animal, as a marine species at the moment, and therefore, we're not open to those resources. We don't get the offer that other marine species do that are in peril.
Yes, is the answer to that. But again, just to give people some good news, there was a big program run by primarily the lead partner was the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust with lots of other partners. But there was a big program run in the English Channel that was called SAMARSH. And as a result of the SAMARSH program, they managed to identify a lot of issues in terms of both salmon and sea trout that relate to this lack of designation. The fact that they're not seen as a legitimate component, inverted commas, of the marine environment. We're not looked to in terms of giving advice when they're building these big marine management programs, because salmon and sea trout are looked on as incidental. So the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust at the moment are doing a really incredible job with the help of the Environment Agency and several other groups. They're reviewing all of this and they're saying, how can we redesignate this fish that, in the case of bigger salmon, spends most of its life at sea? So people are conscious of the fact that they're dealing with this creature. And now, again, that it's designated as near endangered, that gives us fantastic power in terms of being able to make these arguments in ICES and in Brussels.
It sounds like, and I just want confirmation from you, that we need to fund, because it's going to cost money. Anything going out to sea, as we know, is expensive. But does it sound like what would be really useful at this point in time is a campaign that really gets behind studying the fish when they're out at sea? I know we've had a documentary in Lost at Sea, but it seems like we need to step it up a gear. And that's certainly, if that's the case, it's certainly a campaign that I would be very happy to get involved with. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to have a champion within the marine world. I don't think ever again we should try and do it separate to the marine world. That was a nightmare. I mean, great, another documentary to tell you the story of SALSI, which was really fun. But when I think back on it, my God, it could so easily have gone bottom up. Because of the fact we didn't know what we were doing. We were in a strange world. We were trying to do all this stuff afresh. I think we do have really good openings through ICES, which is the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas. NASCO, the North Atlantic Salmon Conservation Organization, has done a fantastic job in working as an intermediary for AST and our partners, so that through our Likely Suspects framework, we've managed to hold a series of workshops with the marine scientists in ICES, where they have offered us all of their marine data, they've offered us advice, they've offered us support. It was the first time ever. That's a fantastic start. So we now need to go to the next stage, and we need to say, and it hasn't worked so far, I thought it would, can we have a place on your boat, and can we say where your boat should go? We're not there just to pick up the pieces you collect when you're looking for herrings. We need to be able to say where your boat can go. If that doesn't work, then we need to go back to the SALC model and basically look for funding to do it ourselves in conjunction with the marine people, because the oceanographers, the people who know about other small marine species, they're invaluable to us. They're essential to us in terms of understanding what's happening. But I think, we haven't time to sit and wait around. And I think we need to go out there. We have the beginnings of a good map now. And if you have a map, you should go exploring. And you need to jump in and start looking at things like this. And I'd be fully behind that, and just row out the boat and see what happens.
Okay, so we're putting the official flare up. Anyone listening who has any context or indeed runs any big, wealthy, national or international marine foundations, please do get in touch. We need you. The salmon need you.
Ken, we asked the last few questions to all our guests, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on these. I'll start off with the one: if you had £1 billion, €1 billion, $1 billion, what would you do to help save the Atlantic salmon?
I'm going to sound like someone from the AST because I'm from the AST. So AST has kicked off the most amazing innovative program in Scotland that I think is fantastic. So it's looking at watersheds, very much like Guido, looking at watersheds, looking at catchments. And it's saying everybody at this stage is putting money into biodiversity loss and into climate change. How can we piggyback on that so we can put catchments back together? So my £1 million would be designate my strongholds and move into those catchments and make sure that the pressures are lifted in those catchments, and that we find a way of actually producing much bigger numbers of these wild fish. Because as I said earlier, we can't replicate the eggs in hatcheries. These are completely unique creatures, but we can help them along by taking a full catchment approach and really putting serious effort in. And we do have some real problems at the moment. We certainly, again, going back to the D, the work that's been done on the D in the last 15 or 20 years in replanting and so on is exemplary in terms of these increasing temperatures that we're seeing. And we're well aware in Britain and Ireland, we've had an enormous amount of water over the last 14 months. We're going to have the equivalent of that in terms of drought over a 14-month period in the very near future. The big problems happen when we have the droughts. Fish are actually relatively good at managing big floods. They're hopeless when there's no water. So my 18 million would be to make sure that we have thought about this and we have capacity to keep those big rivers flowing, to keep them cool, to make sure that we actually have all of the different creatures, the insects and so on, that these fish need to thrive. And we have the conditions for them to thrive. And that's where my money would go.
I like it. Very specific.
So what would that be? Reservoirs and restoration, broadly speaking.
And it may be a matter of not so much that you actually have to have extra water, but you stop losing the water you are at the moment in terms of, we're back to your sewage and your abstraction. But some of these rivers really, for electricity purposes, for a few pence, are being abstracted to put down hydro schemes. They're being abstracted in terms of using water for agricultural purposes and so on. We need to be managing that water very differently. I don't think we're going to get an opportunity to be able to build the reservoirs, but in a drought situation, we have to have a program that we follow to sustain those flows at a critical level to make sure that we're optimizing our smolt production. And again, it needs a wholly catchment approach, I think.
Ken, the second question we ask is, alternatively, you have no money. And this is advice for anybody at home who's sat on the couch or in the car or whatever listening to this podcast. What can we all do to make a difference for the salmon?
Well, I think that certainly in the context of anglers, I would ask anglers to again think of this idea of the gift. I think that's the first big step, is the gift. Just say, no, every day that I fish, I'm going to give this river a gift. I think that's number one. The second thing is that please do get involved with your local community. So I've spent, through my consultancy, about 12 years now working with local communities here in Ireland, teaching them how to look after their local rivers, their local lakes. There's an army of supporters out there that we haven't mobilized yet. Please do get involved with these groups that are looking after these smaller, particularly the smaller streams, the smaller coastal streams for the sea trout, and guide them in terms of how their work is relevant to the conservation of salmon. And I think that doesn't cost any money, makes a huge difference in terms of the effect that it could have, again, in building up these strongholds, these unique rivers that we're trying to actually protect.
I love that idea. Obviously there'll be a lot of anglers listening to this. The gift is just so simple and so effective. Give back to the river that's giving to you. And think about how you can do that, whether it's handling the salmon better, whether it's making sure that you don't tread on any potential reds, a whole plethora of things, resting the river, if the temperature is too much. And I think all river keepers and gillies worth their salt should also, know this stuff, chapter and verse, so that they can advise the rods accordingly. I think if we all were a little more conscientious and, dare I say it, a little more activist about how we fished, I think it would make a big difference.
Ken, it's your last day on Earth. Where do you fish it and who with?
I wouldn't even hesitate but to say on the Zolotoya. So there's this beautiful little gem of a salmon river on the Kola Peninsula called the Zolotoya, the Golden River. It's very similar to our small rivers in the west of Ireland with these little pocket lakes on it. Has the most fantastic population of Atlantic salmon, predominantly grills, but some slightly larger fish. So I only fished it for one day, and I have a set of photographs I just keep going back to them. It was just such a joy. And then we had a great thing happen. The helicopter broke down and they couldn't collect us. And I'm standing at the estuary and I see these fish jumping, and I said, God, they must be sea trout. And then we end the day with the most amazing hour of catching big sea trout at the mouth of this river. And I'm going away in that helicopter and I'm saying, no, just leave me, just leave me. So no, it have to be the Zolotoya. And who would it be? Well, it'd have to be my brother Brendan, because him and my dad my dad's case maybe for 40 years, with Brendan's case over 60 years, we fished together. He'd love it. Yeah.
Ken, it's been absolutely brilliant talking to you. It's been enlightening, informative, engaging. I've learned so much. I think throughout the series, hopefully people have learned so much as well. And what I love about talking to you, Ken, is you've come at it from both sides, from the science, the angling, and hopefully I think people have had a better understanding from listening to you. I certainly have. I'm sure you have, Jim. And I'm a glass half empty when it comes to the plight of the wild Atlantic salmon, but maybe now I'm more glass half full when it comes to the plight of what we can do as anglers and what we might actually see a better future for that side of it. So
you really have given us a very measured and balanced conclusion, I think, to the discussions, all the discussions we've been talking about on this first series of The Last Salmon. And I would like to ask, if I can be so bold, perhaps doing it live puts you in a corner a little bit, but I think things are moving so fast when it comes to the plight of the salmon now, as they should be. And I have a hunch that the next couple of years, we're all going to be learning as we go, anglers, scientists alike, anyone who's at all interested in the Atlantic salmon, or indeed, rivers, cold, clean water. Could you come back on and talk to us as things progress? Because we do need a weather vane. We do need a sage. We do need a Jedi. I'm going to call you a salmon Jedi. We do need guidance.
Obi-Wan.
You are the Obi-Wan of the salmon world. Will you come back and give us your measured wisdom down the line as things no doubt unfold at the speed at which I think they will?
The answer to that is, of course, yes. I'd be delighted to. The reason I'm hesitating is, really, I've had my days, doing my salmon stuff, and I've enjoyed them. I'm seeing some wonderful young scientists now doing their stuff. It's hard for me, obviously, to keep track of all of this because I'm not doing it anything close to full time now. But in the context of what I know and what's available to me, I'd be delighted to do that. But I would encourage you to, look for the young people who are now breaking the mold. The people who are going to say what I said earlier, that's nonsense, and they see a way forward. I'd welcome that. I love that. I love that sort of challenge. And in that context, yes, I'd love to be part of the debate. But I think at this stage, it's going to move on very quickly, as you say. And I think it has to be an integrated approach between the marine and the freshwater if we're going to make any sense of it.
Ken, thanks so much. It's been an honour and an education.
It was a pleasure.
Coming up in the final episode of The Last Salmon.
We've got a bonus episode for everybody here, haven't we, Dara? We've been closely following the story at Iceland that we opened the series with. And there's been some movement, perhaps sadly not all in the right direction. So we're going to throw it back to Elvar Fridriksson from the North Atlantic Salmon Fund and his pal Patagonia ambassador and angler extraordinaire Jasper Pakkinen.
Listen and follow on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to give us your feedback, rate and review. We want to open up the salmon discussion to you.
And remember to keep in the fight for our salmon.